Commons staff and Billy and everyone for their help making all of this happen. Thank you. So Brooklyn for Peace has been working in Brooklyn since 1984. We are a democratically functioning, nonpartisan group. We are committed to eliminating war and the social injustices that are its causes. Through active education on international and domestic issues, we empower our community and ourselves to be a productive force in securing a peaceful future for generations to come. I'd also like to thank every co-sponsor for this event. The co-sponsors are All Souls, New York City chapter of Unitarian Universalists for Justice in the Middle East, Code Pink, International Action Center, Peace Action New York State, Tree of Life Education Fund, United National Anti-War Coalition, Veterans for Peace, New York City Chapter 34, War Resisters League, New York City Chapter, and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. So the last thing before we get started with the film, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge and honor that the land on which we are gathered here tonight is the seized and occupied territory of the Lenape people, who have stewarded this land for generations. And I ask that we all take a moment to pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and really contemplate the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here tonight. So if you could just take a moment. Great, so I think we can just get started with the film. So Ray is the director of Reaching Critical Will, the disarmament program of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. As you said in the documentary, WILPF was founded in 1915 to challenge militarism, patriarchy, and capitalism as root causes of war. And Ray continues this work today by bringing an intersectional feminist approach to disarmament and anti-war work.
Great, well thank you Emily and Brooklyn for Peace for hosting this event. It's actually the first time I've seen the movie, so it was pretty good actually. I wasn't too worried. Tony's done a lot of great filmmaking and media work in the past, so I felt comfortable showing up here tonight. But it was also really excellent to see a lot of the old photographs over the years, younger versions of myself and my friends that I've been doing this work with. I have been involved in ICANN since its very beginning. It was launched in 2007 in Australia, and then they did an international launch in Vienna later that year, and so I kind of got involved at that point and have been through this very exciting ride the whole way, and have been doing the work both inside the United Nations. You saw lots of pictures of us wearing our suits, and then lots of pictures of us out on the streets with our banners and our megaphones. That one was in front of Pine Gap in Australia, which is where the United States launches a lot of, or targets a lot of its drones from, and targets nuclear weapons from that base in the middle of nowhere in Australia. So we went out there to raise a bit of hell, which is what we do, inside and outside of the UN. So I don't really have too much more to say. The film covered so much ground. I just kind of want to hear from you what your reflections are, what your questions are. Are there gaps missing in this storyline that you want to hear more about? It is a rich story that, of course, ICANN is such a modern piece of it, but so many of you have been doing this work for so long. I got involved in anti-nuclear activism through Randy Forsberg, who many of you probably knew. She was the leader of the nuclear freeze movement in the 80s. So she kind of taught me what I know to get started in this work. And there's just been so much brilliant, resilient activism that has gone into the quest to abolish nuclear weapons for so long. And it's amazing how far we've come. But of course, how much further we have to go in this story. Banning nuclear weapons at the United Nations is by no means the end of the story. And what I'm inspired by today is all of the local activism happening So you heard at the end about the ICANN cities appeal, the Don't Bank on the Bomb divestment work, and a lot of that is happening right here in New York City. It's happening in other cities around the United States. It's happening across Europe, in Canada, in Australia as well. We have some races. I think Germany's winning right now in the cities appeal, right? Yeah. So, and Australia might be a close second. So the US has some catching up to do, but big cities here, Baltimore, Washington, DC, Los Angeles, have all joined the ICANN Cities Appeal, and so there's a lot of work to be done, but it's work that can be done, and I think we tried to communicate that in our interventions at the end of the film. And in New York City, we have some legislation right now before the City Council that is both endorsing the ban treaty, but also looking to divest New York City pension funds from nuclear weapon-related activities. And this kind of work can be replicated in cities across this country and elsewhere. So can we open it up to questions? Is that cool?
Yeah.
All right. Unless there's anything else you wanted me to say.
No, I wanted to take just 1 minute before we open for questions to make like an announcement while everyone's attention is here and we're not trying to like run out. Just real quick, and then we can open up. Yeah, so such awkward like. So I just wanted to, while I have everyone's attention, firstly plug our next event, which we have a flyer for that you should totally grab on the way out. It's about the 2020 census with particular focus to the concerns of the immigrant communities and how they're impacted and undercounted, etc. That's done in collaboration with United Community Centers in East New York. So that's coming up, and we're also looking for volunteers for fall street fairs. We're doing the Flatbush Frolic and the Atlantic Antic, so the last 2 Sundays of September. So if you're available and want to help out at the street fairs, it's a really great way to meet other Brooklyn for Peace folks or reconnect with them if maybe you haven't been seeing them, and also a great opportunity to engage with like local Brooklyn peeps who you might not really be able to otherwise. So those are the 2 things that I wanted to plug. Lastly, these events are free. We want to make sure they're accessible for everyone, but we will be passing a donation bucket in the hopes that if you're able to, you will try to help us offset the cost of running these programs and other programs like it. So we'll pass the bucket in a moment, and yeah, we can open for questions now. Would you like to facilitate the questions, or would you like to? Yeah, cool. I could grab you a chair if you want to sit. Whatever you're comfortable with. Okay, cool.
I'll get back in my corner.
Make sure you're comfortable.
Yeah, so there was one at the back, yes.
What lessons are there to be learned from the successful ban of landmines and the somewhat successful ban of chemical weapons? How did that occur, and what is different about nuclear weapons? How can we replicate what they did, and what is so very different about nuclear weapons that it is still a very uphill battle?
Yeah, excellent question. So we learned a lot, really, actually, from the prohibitions on landmines and on cluster munitions as well. And the thing with both of those treaties is that they really did come from an activist campaign that worked directly with the survivors and framed it around the humanitarian harm caused by the weapons, the indiscriminate harm that these weapons caused. And things that are similar between those weapons and nuclear weapons is the way they were discussed before they were prohibited. Militaries would say these weapons were essential to their security, and that there was no way that they could be prohibited. And it was really this framing around humanitarian consequences that brought a number of governments on board a position to ban them, despite the United States and others saying no, it wasn't possible. The main difference between the campaigns to ban those weapons and ICANN's work to get a treaty to ban nuclear weapons is that so many fewer countries possess nuclear weapons. So with landmines and cluster bombs, a large number of governments had these weapons, used these weapons, made them, sold them. They were part of war, part of conflict. But with nuclear weapons, only 9 countries possess them. And you have the North Atlantic Treaty Organization states that say that they rely on US nuclear weapons for security, etc. But at the end of the day, you only have 9 countries that possess these weapons. And they're treated so differently, and we went through that a little bit in the film about how they're treated in a security discourse and all this logic around deterrence that has really become entrenched in mainstream thinking about these weapons that was quite different than the other categories of weapons that we prohibited. We didn't have that kind of infrastructure, resilient infrastructure of thought around these weapons as being instrumental to security in that same way. But we still took the same approach with the humanitarian framing that was discussed in the film. And that was the main lesson that we really learned, also to work with the governments that were willing to work with us. And a lot of the same leaders from the prohibitions on landmines and cluster bombs came along on this one too, particularly those from the global south. We lost most of the Europeans, of course, but we still had other countries from the global south that were major players in those processes that had learned lessons as well, how to work together cross-regionally, how to work with activists on these issues, and how to develop new international law. The other significant thing about all of these treaties, from the bans on biological and chemical weapons through to landmines and cluster bombs and now nuclear weapons, is that we've really developed this overarching framing that's now known as humanitarian disarmament. And this was something when bioweapons and chemical weapons were banned, they didn't really exist as a concept. So it's been something that sort of developed over time on the basis of activists working with like-minded governments to prohibit weapons for the sake of humanity. And you can see this playing out as well in efforts to stop the international arms trade, in efforts to end bombings of towns and cities, in efforts to stem the flow of small arms and light weapons. So there's a whole community of actors now that rely on these same framings and practices, and people, the individual people as well, passing on these lessons or being involved in one thing to the next as well, and learning from each other, and when we can, bringing people together to discuss how we did things, what works, what doesn't work, and moving forward collectively in that way. So we're all always learning from one thing to the next. One here, then here. Behind you.
Thank you for that. My question is, out of the 50 states that need to ratify the treaty for it to enter into force, where are we now, and what's going to happen at the UN General Assembly in a couple of weeks?
That's a great question too. So we currently have 26 ratifications of the treaty. Just last week we had Kazakhstan, our most recent, who signed, or ratified actually on the anniversary of the end of the Russian tests, right? That's what the 29th is, basically, and giving back the nuclear weapons and all that jazz. So we have, on the 26th of September at the UN, there will be another signing ratification ceremony. So it'll be open again to all governments to come in and sign and ratify. So we have a small dedicated team of people that work on that to try and get countries to put pen to paper. Of course, we have 122 that voted yes at the UN, as you saw on the big board. And so we need them to actualize that commitment. We have a few countries that have said they'll do it, which we're not allowed to say who they are, but we do have some that are in the dock, ready to do it. So we know that we'll have a few more as of the 26th. But that is certainly something that is a priority for ICANN over the next couple of years, making sure that the treaty enters into force as soon as possible. And it generally takes a couple years, unfortunately. It is a slow process, and it doesn't matter how committed your government is. Sometimes internally it just takes a long time to do it. For example, Ireland is one of the major champions of this treaty, and they still haven't managed to actually get the legislation through. And it's not because anybody in the Irish political scene is trying to block it. they're just dealing with Brexit or they're dealing with other things that they have to get done. And so it can take a long time, and this is the thankless, sometimes joyless part of activism, is just the constant phone calls and emails and badgering that we're all familiar with, I'm sure. Yes. So I had you, I think, and then you.
That was my question.
Oh, great, excellent. So then you.
I just had a comment. It's just so discouraging, the connection between nuclear power and nuclear weapons that they're talking about with the whole climate thing. Some people feel they have to have nuclear power, which is a terrible idea. But I think it must be making this work even more difficult.
Well, on this particular treaty, because it's just prohibiting nuclear weapons, the nuclear energy question hasn't affected our work of getting this treaty to enter into force, which is a good thing. But I definitely think that the climate discussion that is pulling in nuclear power as some sort of solution is terrible, and I'm hoping that as many of you as possible can meet with Greta while she's here and make sure that she has good talking points on nuclear power. Yes?
I was thinking of my family and also some of my friends. They never would discuss this kind of thing, and it's not for lack of education or lack of a liberal spirit and things like that. But when they get together, they talk about, you know, what TV series they're watching. So is there any structure that could bring that, or have you contemplated any structure to bring this kind of discussion into the general community, not the activist layer of it that follows this stuff and comes to see these kinds of films?
Yeah, it's always a tough question, I think, on a lot of political issues, and some have more salience than others, right? I mean, I think the climate debate and also in this country the gun violence debate has to some degree broken through and become something that people talk about now, and nuclear weapons not so much. But we try to speak with students as much as possible, high schools and also university students, hoping that if they're inspired by this story, then it will become something that they want to talk about with their friends or their families. We try and engage as many different communities that are interested in this as well. We have ongoing projects with different artist groups and things like that. People who are involved in protest movements or activist movements on different issues that might want to work this in, or that are also interested in working on this issue. So it's sort of an ongoing challenge, though, I think, to really engage a broader public. Since the 1980s, this issue, it's been really hard to get that public traction on. And at moments we can. And there are some ways in which this issue is back in the news more now than it ever was with what's been going on with Trump and Kim, North Korea. And what we don't want to see, of course, is the situation where nuclear weapons are used, and that's when people start talking about this again. So we're trying to prevent that from happening. But I always find that the most discouraging thing when people say, oh, we have to wait until we have another use of nuclear weapons. Well, we've had 2, and we've had 2,000 tests, and we didn't solve the problem on that basis. So I don't think it's going to be the bombs exploding that fixes this for us. I think it's going to be a larger network of activism and of contemplation of this issue and what it means for our lives and how we organize ourselves as societies and all of that, which is a much bigger project, of course. Yes?
You know, one of the dangers that the movie didn't talk about is the danger of an accident on a nuclear facility now. That's something I think that really needs to be stressed. There have been a couple of very near accidents. I mean, there was a film a couple of years ago about a missile facility where there was a serious accident that barely avoided catastrophe for wiping out a whole state. I think it was Tennessee.
Yeah.
Where we now have this accident that we don't know very much about in Russia, and I wonder if you know more about that and if that's something we need to talk about.
I definitely think that the accidents are important to discuss. There has been some really good research on that. There's a book by Eric Schlosser called Command and Control.
Yeah, that was what the movie was.
Okay, great. So yeah, I would recommend that as a good source. And there's a few others out there that really dive into that. And I think that that can be a very compelling argument for some people. But I also think some people think that accidents are rare, or that they can be, oh, we just need more money invested in securing those facilities, or we just need to have a better command and control system, or we need to make ourselves more infallible. And I think that's a natural response from a lot of us. So I don't always find it the most compelling to make the argument for total abolition. But I think it works for some people, and it can scare some people in realizing how fallible the systems are. And I think if that's what's working in your discourse with people, then that's absolutely the way that you should go. But I've just found that then the conversation kind of turns elsewhere. Well, how do we fix that problem when the problem that we're trying to fix is the existence of these weapons overall?
When they said in the film about the companies that make the nuclear weapons, I can remember years ago when my girlfriend's father was in the Navy in California, the companies would send suggestions to the government about what kind of weapons to make, or what kind of equipment they could make for them. I'm wondering if that goes on today. That the companies tell the nuclear, blah, 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 this is what we could make for you. Or does the government order it? And what are these companies? I never thought of attacking them. The ones that make
Yeah, I think a lot of that still happens, definitely. And these companies are often tied very closely with universities as well. So there's a direct connection to research departments in a lot of major scientific universities. So some of the main companies are Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Bechtel, Boeing, General Electric, General Dynamics. So there's, and out in, you heard a little bit in the film about New Mexico being kind of the birthplace of the bomb, and so out in New Mexico, a bunch of these companies as a coalition run the nuclear weapon laboratory there and in Lawrence Livermore in California. And so this is where these weapons and many of the components, the core parts, are being manufactured. And so they're directly tied then into the University of California school system and into the University of New Mexico school system. And so there's a direct relationship there between academia, scientific innovation, and the weapons bomb complexes. So it's a huge problem, and that's why we do try to target the companies. We have the Don't Bank on the Bomb process that if you go to don'tbankonthebomb.com, you can see all of the companies that are involved in manufacturing nuclear weapons. You can see what banks are in giving money to these companies, pension funds, all of that kind of stuff. So you can really trace where your money is going as well through this, through where your money is, and cause a fuss about it at your bank if you want to do that kind of work, which I think is really important.
With the development that's been going on with the hypersonic missiles, which it takes ICBMs 20 minutes to from Russia to the United States. What it does is give such a strategic advantage for a first strike. So is there any, do you get any sense within the U.S. military and any other militaries that having that weapon advantage is almost going to guarantee a nuclear war? Because the new cruise missiles are so fast that they only make sense for.
Right. Well, I mean, I hope people in the military are recognizing this. I think we're recognizing that this is going to be a problem, right? But I don't know enough about the insides of the U.S. military system to know if there's people there that recognize that this is a coming problem that they need to push back on, or if it's just we need the latest technology as they tend to do, which is how we've ended up at one point with 80,000 nuclear weapons. So I think that tends to be where that mindset goes, is more is better, newer is better, faster is better.
I represent a social action committee at my church here in Brooklyn, and I'm wondering what we could do, if any of you have material that I can bring back to them, or like letters
anything here. Do we have anything on the New York website that would be useful?
Well, I mean, we do have the don'tbankonthebomb.com/NYC that talks about the bills that Ray mentioned. And certainly, this is a great opportunity to ask those of you who are New Yorkers, which is probably all of you, and to make sure that your city council members already signed on and co-sponsored these two bills. One's Resolution 976 and INT 1621, and you can ask me, I could look up your council member, if you tell me who they are, I can tell you, or Anthony Donovan also is working on this right here, and we can tell you, and make sure that they signed on. But those are the bills that, as Ray said, support the city appeal, like say that New York supports the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that we're working on, that call for divestment of New York City pension funds. It's not only your banks, but as was also noted, if you have a pension fund with the city of New York, we have $500 million invested from New York pension fund money in the production of nuclear weapons. So it calls for the controller to divest from our pension funds from nuclear weapon production. And it also reaffirms New York City as a nuclear weapon-free zone, which many people of my generation certainly don't realize that New York City used to host nuclear weapons. So it's reaffirming that we don't want them here, and then it sets up an advisory committee saying that we're going to look into ways that we can make sure New York City enforces its nuclear weapon-free zone status. So these two bills, 1621 and 976, are the ones that we want you to call your council member about.
Is there anything in the state legislature, because they have a lot of...
That's coming next. That's not yet, but that will be coming.
We have that in the works, yes. So happy to have all of your help with that. But yeah, the website again is don'tbankonthebomb.com, and then for the New York stuff, it's /NYC. So we have one printout here. Is that what you're holding? So
It doesn't have any specifics on those bills that you mentioned, but I pulled it all from a website called nuclearban.org, which seemed to be,
No, the ICANN one.
Okay.
yeah, it seemed to be like a project of ICANN
Yeah.
or something. They had really great information, lots of detailed steps on things you can do. I boiled down the steps here so I could give you this copy, and then there's the link, and anyone else who wants a copy, there are plenty of here. So it just has sort of like a very condensed version of what's on there. There's so much information on there, and like lots of links to different videos. Like there was a music video. It was just cool, like cultural things too. So you should totally check that out if you're looking for more info.
Yeah.
It was nuclearban.org.
Questions?
So yeah.
Any advice on injecting this issue into the presidential campaign, where in general foreign policy isn't being talked about, but specifically certainly anything about nuclear weapons, about spending money on the quote-unquote upgrade of nuclear weapons so that we can compete with China, who apparently has new and shiny weapons. This isn't talked about at all, and your thoughts on what we can do, whether it's contacting the media, the local political clubs, to get this to be an issue that the candidates are at least asked about.
Yeah, I think that that's a great issue to raise and a great action to do. And yeah, like you say, that can be through writing into local or bigger papers with questions about it, contacting political clubs, like you say, if you have connections to any of these candidates or their affiliates to raise as an issue, I think is really good. I'm not an American, I should say, so your whole system confuses me sometimes, or at least I pretend it does. So I'm not the best person to answer how you get questions into political debates, but I think that it is important for candidates to discuss this. And I'm trying to think, at the two debates they did with everybody, like it was sort of talked about, but only in relation to nuclear proliferation in North Korea, I think. Like, what would you do with North Korea? Alicia has a two-finger on this to answer, I think.
Yeah, I just wanted to
say that there's some resources that on bird dogging candidates that you can find, like when the campaign really starts in earnest, you can find when candidates are going to be in your area, and then you can just show up and just shout your question over and over again really loud. And there's like the famous one that a guy from Iraq Veterans Who Are Against the War did with John McCain, where he was like, I wish the war would go on forever. And that became a soundbite in the news and really kind of sunk him a little bit. So it's very effective. I mean, but it takes a lot of work. Yeah, but it's effective.
Okay.
Great mind.
There's a lot of that
Can you say more about what the strategy is of the ban treaty in terms of the states that currently have nuclear weapons and just boycotting the whole thing? Like, what is going to get them to give up their weapons? Like, why should they follow?
Right. So yeah. So we deliberately, as the film I think went into a little bit, but maybe not enough. We went ahead with this with non-nuclear armed countries. So none of the nuclear armed states have signed this treaty, and some of their leaders have even said they never will, which is funny coming from democratic governments asserting things like that, or supposedly democratic governments. But the idea behind doing it this way was that they weren't going to do it themselves. But what we found worked in the case of the other treaties prohibiting weapons was that the pressure and the stigmatization that builds over time has an impact on their policies. So, for example, the United States has not joined the landmines or cluster bomb treaty, and yet doesn't produce either weapon anymore. It only uses landmines in the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea and nowhere else in the world. The last producer of cluster munitions in the United States announced a couple of years ago now that it was not going to make any more of these bombs because stigmatization had grown so great. There was no longer any economic incentive for them to continue manufacturing these weapons. And so while those prohibitions also aren't perfect in the fact that there are still landmines, there's still massive cleanup to be done. Cluster bombs are being used right now in a few cases, particularly in Syria and Yemen. We are seeing that the stigmatization has been so great that it has actually had an effect on policies of governments that stood outside the treaty. Some of the countries that said they would never join, like the United Kingdom, have joined those treaties and are compliant with those treaties. So this assertion of saying we'll never join is meaningless to those of us who've been involved in these other activist campaigns, because the whole theory of change that we've employed here is, as we talked about in the film, what we've seen work in other instances of social justice, whether it comes down to slavery or the right to vote or apartheid, that the idea that you shift things, you shift what's normal, you shift the normative over time. And it's not a perfect fix, it's not an immediate fix, it takes a while, but we also don't know what the cascading effects will be of this. And so that's the exciting part, the kind of unpredictable part of it, I think. We don't know what it will be that will help us actually get to the total elimination of nuclear weapons, but we're confident this is a very important piece of that puzzle that we do now have at our disposal. I think the other important thing about treaties is the ways that we can use them once they are in force. So for example, when it comes to the international arms trade, we do have an arms trade treaty that was adopted in 2013. It's way worse of a treaty than we have on nuclear weapons. It's got some pretty significant loopholes, and some of its major champions, like the United Kingdom, are still profiting wildly off the arms trade, and they're actually violating the treaty. But what we're able to do now that we have this instrument is sue these governments for violating it. And so before we didn't have anything to hold the UK to account. Right now, the Secretary of State it's been found that the previous Secretary of State in the UK made unlawful arms decisions in terms of selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. And without the Arms Trade Treaty, we probably would not have been able to get that ruling. And so there are ways that we can use international law, even if it's kind of going around doing an unrun, applying it here, applying it there. It's something that we have as a tool that will be able to hold countries to account for their behavior in ways that we couldn't without it.
Isn't the U.S. also selling weapons to Saudi Arabia?
Yes, but the United States is not party to the Arms Trade Treaty. They were a signatory under Obama, but Trump has done the equivalent of revoking that signature, which he can't actually do, but he's basically pulled them out. Yeah. So I have one here and then here. Yeah.
No, only I want to say I'm very happy to be tonight, and we are from Presenza. We made the documentary, and we provide the documentary, and it's a very good opportunity for us and for everybody. So I'm so happy to be here, and thank you for the opportunity, and it's a very good. We need to talk to the people. We need to present this anytime this documentary, because that's the way. It's the only way. So thank you so much. We are from Presenza. I am very happy.
Thank you for being here. Yeah. You made a great documentary.
And also Presenza is very good. The International Press Agency. And you can find every day good news, bad news, but the real news. So Presenza. Okay? Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, my question is, it's not really a question. I guess I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about what you and other folks who are doing this disarmament work are doing to build those connections with other social justice movements. The documentary did touch about the catastrophic impact that nuclear weapons would have on climate, for example. But I don't really feel like I see climate groups like talking about that or doing mobilization against that. And I know, it speaks to like a larger like working in silos and the need to not do that. But I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about like if there's been success that you've had in like doing that cross movement work, and you could talk.
Yeah, I think the climate is a great cross-cutting issue for this, for sure. And Ira, who's interviewed in the film, he and his group, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, they always talk about it as the twin crises that we're facing now. And so I think it would be amazing to see more pickup of the nuclear issue within the climate change movement. But you're right, I haven't seen a lot of it either, not successfully on a large scale. And I think that there's also room in this country, I mentioned gun violence earlier as well, I think looking at these as a spectrum of violence issue and concepts of security and what it means to be safe in a community or in a country, and are weapons providing this solution, or are they making us less safe? So I think that would be another great connection to build up here. But again, I haven't really seen that make its way in, other than in small conversations or moments of dialogue, but not on a broad scale. And there's a lot more work to be done, I think, on that. And particularly, I think the student activism is really inspiring on a lot of these issues, and that's where I think it's going to happen, if it is going to happen. Not to like punt it off to students, but I do think that that's, when I was doing student activism with a group called Think Outside the Bomb, which unfortunately no longer exists, we really did try to do that, bridging the issues, and also bridging the styles of work, where we would do a lot of direct action, but then we'd also do a lot of really super intense, very nerdy research around ties between our schools and the military-industrial complex and things like that. And then we'd do all that research, and then we'd go sit in on regents meetings at the University of California and things like that. So, so I do see a lot of hope. I think there more than anywhere else at the moment, but I don't really have a grand strategy to make that happen. I wish I did, except just always talking about it and saying yes to as many of these things and student engagements as possible to see what can fly.
Just, sorry to put my moderator hat on for a second. We have 10 minutes.
Okay.
So maybe 2 more questions?
Yeah, so head up here.
Is there a direct link between a nuclear power plant that's producing electricity and the manufacture of these bombs?
Of course.
So
You make
would
a bomb out of nuclear reactor.
all right. So
The material.
1974.
The material that's used in both is the same material. It's uranium. It's just enriched, so it's processed to a different degree from what would be used in a nuclear power plant to what would be used in a nuclear bomb. But it's the same fundamental ingredient.
would it make sense to try to go after oppose nuclear energy? Just, I mean, not that that'll stop it, but I would think that would be a tactic that, you know.
Yeah, I think a lot of anti-nuclear weapon activists are also anti-nuclear activists across the whole spectrum and do oppose nuclear power. Certainly, my organization, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, opposes both. And a lot of the member groups of ICANN oppose both. For this particular campaign, we focused just on nuclear weapons and on getting this treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. But certainly the activism, the anti-nuclear activism is largely against both. And because of these connections and the destruction that both cause, from mining the uranium all the way to what do you do with all this waste, which there's still no solution for.
There is a solution. The breeder reactor would use up the waste. All the uranium that's all in the reactors all over the country and the world, or in casks or in cooling pools, could be used up as a fuel and the breeder reactor is not going to explode and stuff like that.
Yeah, I just wanted to address the point that was raised a minute ago about connections between climate change and, well, in essence, military spending. The Brooklyn for Peace has a Peace and Economic Justice Committee, and we are working on a flyer to have ready for the street figures that we discussed. Of course, like any committee, we've got about 15 different versions. And putting them into one version is taking us a little longer than we'd hoped, but hopefully we'll have a pamphlet ready, or at least a handout.
That's excellent. Very cool. So is that our 2, I think?
I do think there's time for one more if anyone has any burning.
This concerning Turkey, we just announced today that there's no reason for them to not have nuclear weapons, and coming from the people who have nuclear weapons to tell them to not have them, it seems to be displaced. So I don't know. Do you have any take on this?
I think hypocrisy is the specialty of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council on pretty much every issue. But yeah, I think it really shows the problem of countries that say they oppose nuclear weapons, but then also oppose the nuclear ban treaty. So we do have this category of states, like my own Canada, who says, we don't think anyone should have nuclear weapons. We support nuclear disarmament, but we oppose your treaty because right now we have nuclear weapons, so we need to keep them. Well, not Canada, but the U.S. does, and we're beholden to our U.S. masters. So we do what they say, and so that category of countries are in direct contradiction, I think, more than anyone else, because they are saying that nuclear weapons are useful for security and that certain countries should be able to have them, and it sets up situations exactly like this. And I think that's one of the main arguments for the total abolition of nuclear weapons, because if you don't get rid of all of them, then proliferation is always going to be the risk, because somebody else is going to want them if somebody has them.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ray. At our gala in November, our Pathmakers to Peace Gala, Ray will be one of our Pathmakers to Peace this year for her incredible work and also support Brooklyn for Peace should come to the gala. It's November 7th. And there's like lots of info on our website. I just have to plug that real quick. But thank you all so much. We have, yeah, that would be cool. A photo.
Photo.
Of everyone, like the yeah, a picture, a group photo.
Peace or
It's peaceful, enjoy. Peace, that's what we need.
Okay, great.